The sun was just beginning to rise over the peaceful countryside, painting the fields in warm shades of gold and orange. Birds chirped softly, and the morning mist hung low over the grass, giving the place an almost magical feel. It was the kind of quiet morning where nothing extraordinary seemed likely to happen. But life, as we all know, has a way of surprising us in the most unexpected ways. In the middle of this serene setting, a horse named Daisy grazed lazily near the edge of the pasture. Daisy wasn't just any horse. She was known for her gentle nature and sharp instincts. The kind of horse that kids would feel safe around, the kind that seemed to sense emotions better than most people. Her owners often joked that Daisy had the soul of a caretaker. But little did they know, she was about to live up to that reputation in a way no one could have imagined. As Daisy wandered closer to the tree line, her ears perked up. There was a strange sound, a faint, muffled noise carried by the breeze. She paused, lifting her head and twitching her ears, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. At first, it seemed like the cry of a bird or a stray animal, but there was something different about it. Something human, driven by curiosity, or perhaps something deeper. Daisy followed the sound. Her hooves crunched softly on the dewy grass as she moved toward a cluster of bushes near the fence. And then she stopped abruptly, her large brown eyes focused on something out of place. Nestled in the shadows of the bushes was a small, tattered cardboard box. The crying sound was coming from inside. Now, if Daisy were just any horse, she might have ignored it and gone on her way. But Daisy wasn't just any horse. She lowered her head and sniffed the box carefully, her breath warm and steady. Inside, a tiny, delicate movement caught her eye. There, wrapped in a thin, worn blanket, was a baby. A real, living baby. Daisy let out a soft whinny, almost as if she were calling for help. Her movements were cautious, almost protective, as she nudged the box gently with her nose. The baby's cries grew louder, filling the quiet morning air with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. It was as if Daisy understood that this little life was in desperate need of help, and that she was the one who had to make sure it got it. Back at the farmhouse, Daisy's owner, Sarah, was sipping her morning coffee on the porch. She had been keeping an eye on Daisy from a distance, as she often did, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of her horse's movements. But now, Sarah noticed something strange. Daisy was pacing near the edge of the pasture, her head bobbing up and down as if trying to get Sarah's attention. Frowning, Sarah set down her mug and stood up. "What's gotten into you, girl?" she muttered to herself as she grabbed her boots and headed toward the fence. The closer she got, the more insistent Daisy's behavior became. The horse whinnied again, turning her head toward the bushes and then back at Sarah, urging her to follow. When Sarah finally reached the spot, her heart nearly stopped. She saw the box, the blanket, and the impossibly tiny baby inside. For a moment, she couldn't move, her mind racing to process what she was seeing. Who would leave a baby out here, in the middle of nowhere? How long had the child been there? And perhaps most haunting of all, what would have happened if Daisy hadn't found it? With trembling hands, Sarah carefully lifted the baby out of the box. The child's face was red from crying, but as soon as Sarah held it close, the cries softened into weak whimpers. The baby was cold, far too cold, and Sarah could feel her own panic rising. She wrapped the blanket tighter around the baby and whispered soothing words, even though her own voice was shaking. Daisy stood close by, her eyes fixed on Sarah and the baby. It was as if the horse was standing guard, making sure everything was okay. Sarah glanced at Daisy, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved this baby, girl. You really did." But the story didn't end there. Far from it. What happened next would reveal more about the baby's mysterious arrival, the incredible bond between humans and animals, and the way unexpected moments can bring out the best in all of us. Stay with us, because what comes next is a journey you won't want to miss. Sarah didn't waste a second. Cradling the baby in her arms, she turned and hurried back toward the farmhouse, with Daisy following close behind as if she understood the urgency of the moment. The baby's cries were faint now, and Sarah's heart pounded with fear. She had no idea how long the child had been out there or what kind of condition it was in. All she knew was that she had to act quickly. When she reached the house, Sarah gently placed the baby on the kitchen table, clearing away her morning newspaper and coffee cup. The baby's tiny face was still scrunched up, and its cheeks were flushed red from the cold. Sarah grabbed a soft towel from the drawer and carefully wrapped the child, trying to warm it up. She fumbled for her phone with shaking hands, dialing 911. 911, what's your emergency? The calm voice on the other end steadied her, if only slightly. Sarah stammered, still trying to catch her breath. I found a baby. In a box. Outside. Near my pasture. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher's voice returned, more focused. You found a baby? Is the child breathing? Yes, Sarah said quickly, glancing down at the baby. But they're cold and I don't know how long they've been out there. Stay on the line, ma'am. Help is on the way, the dispatcher assured her. Sarah nodded to herself, even though no one could see. She didn't realize how tightly she'd been gripping the phone until she set it down and looked at her hand, shaking from both adrenaline and fear. The baby stirred slightly, letting out a soft whimper, and Sarah leaned closer, speaking gently. It's okay, little one. Help's coming. You're safe now. Outside the window, Daisy stood near the porch, her large brown eyes fixed on the house. Sarah couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude toward her horse. If Daisy hadn't found the baby, Sarah might never have known it was there. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah's mind raced with questions. Who had left the baby there? And why? The farm was fairly isolated, surrounded by miles of fields and woods. It wasn't the kind of place someone would just stumble upon by accident. Whoever left the baby must have known it was out of the way. But why leave a child in such a dangerous spot? Sarah's chest tightened at the thought. If Daisy hadn't been so curious, the baby might not have survived the cold morning. When the sound of sirens finally broke the silence, Sarah felt a wave of relief. She stepped outside as the ambulance pulled up, and two paramedics quickly got out, their faces a mix of concern and determination. Sarah led them into the kitchen, explaining everything as best as she could. This is the baby, she said, stepping aside so the paramedics could get a closer look. I found them in a box near the pasture. My horse, Daisy, she's the one who noticed it. The paramedics nodded, their movements calm but efficient as they checked the baby's vital signs. One of them looked up at Sarah. You did the right thing calling us. The baby's cold but stable. We'll take them to the hospital to make sure they're okay. Sarah felt a small measure of relief, but her heart still ached with unanswered questions. Will they be all right? The paramedic offered a reassuring smile. It looks like you found them just in time. That's what matters. As they prepared to leave, Sarah couldn't help but ask, what happens now? What about the baby? The authorities will investigate, one of the paramedics explained. They'll try to find out where the child came from and who might have left them. In the meantime, social services will take over. Sarah nodded, though the answer left her with a hollow feeling. She watched as they carried the baby out to the ambulance, the small form swaddled tightly in blankets. As the vehicle pulled away, Sarah stood on the porch, her arms crossed tightly against the chill in the air. Daisy nickered softly from the pasture, as if sensing Sarah's unease. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the baby, wondering who they were and why someone would abandon them. Her thoughts drifted back to Daisy, who had seemed so determined to lead her to the box. It wasn't the first time Sarah had marveled at her horse's intuition, but this felt different, almost like fate. The next morning, Sarah found herself drawn back to the spot where Daisy had found the baby. The bushes were still there, the grass trampled where the box had been. She crouched down, scanning the area for any clues. There was nothing obvious, just the faint imprint of the box in the dirt. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. As the days passed, Sarah kept in touch with the local authorities, hoping for news about the baby. Each time she called, the answer was the same: no updates yet. It was as if the child had appeared out of thin air, with no trace of where they'd come from or who might have left them. The mystery weighed heavily on Sarah's mind. Daisy, on the other hand, seemed unfazed by the events. She went about her days as usual, grazing in the pasture and nuzzling Sarah whenever she came near. But Sarah couldn't help but feel a deeper bond with the horse now, a sense of gratitude that went beyond words. Daisy had saved a life, a fact Sarah would never forget. One evening, about a week after the baby was found, there was a knock at Sarah's door. She opened it to find a police officer standing on the porch, his expression serious but kind. "We have some news," he said. "About the baby." Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She stepped aside to let him in, her mind racing. As the officer began to speak, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place. But the full picture was still unclear, and the answers only seemed to lead to more questions. What Sarah learned that night would change everything she thought she knew about that quiet morning in the pasture. And it would set her on a path she never could have imagined, a path filled with unexpected challenges, heartwarming discoveries, and the kind of moments that stay with you forever. But those answers and the twists that lay ahead were just the beginning of the story. Sarah sat on the edge of her chair, the officer's words still echoing in her mind. "We found a lead," he said, his tone measured. "But it's complicated." Her fingers gripped the edge of the table as she leaned forward. "What do you mean? What kind of lead?" The officer glanced down at the notepad in his hand, flipping through a few pages before responding. The blanket the baby was wrapped in, it's distinctive. Handmade, with a pattern not commonly sold in stores. One of our investigators recognized it. There's a local woman who makes similar blankets for a community craft fair. He hesitated, as if bracing for her reaction. "We're looking into whether she might know something." Sarah's mind raced. A blanket? That small detail was the only clue they had? But then again, it made sense. In a case like this, even the smallest breadcrumb could lead to answers. "Have you talked to her yet?" she asked, her voice tense with anticipation. "Not yet," the officer admitted. "We're following protocol, but we'll reach out to her soon." As the officer left, Sarah found herself staring out the window, her thoughts spinning. The idea of someone deliberately leaving the baby in her pasture gnawed at her. She couldn't understand how anyone could abandon such a fragile, helpless child. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something deeper, something she wasn't seeing. Daisy, as always, seemed to sense her unease. The horse stood near the fence, her head low as she grazed, her presence a quiet comfort. Sarah stepped outside, her boots crunching on the gravel driveway. She approached Daisy, running her hand along the horse's neck. "What do you think, girl?" she murmured. "Who would do something like this? And why here?" Daisy snorted softly, her ears flicking back and forth. Sarah couldn't help but smile, even in the midst of her worry. "You probably know more than I do," she said. "If only you could talk." The days that followed were a blur of unanswered questions and restless nights. Sarah called the police station regularly, hoping for updates. Each time, the answer was the same. They were still investigating. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her hope alive. Meanwhile, life on the farm continued. Sarah found herself more attuned to Daisy's movements, watching the horse with a new sense of appreciation. Every morning, she would spend a little extra time in the pasture, brushing Daisy's coat and talking to her as if the horse could understand every word. But the quiet routine was shattered one afternoon when Sarah noticed a car parked at the end of her driveway. It was an old sedan, its paint faded and peeling. The driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 20s, with tired eyes and a nervous energy that was hard to miss. "Can I help you?" Sarah called, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. The woman hesitated, glancing around as if unsure whether she should stay or leave. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped closer. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice soft. I heard about the baby, the one you found." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She studied the woman carefully, searching for any hint of her intentions. "You heard about the baby?" she repeated cautiously. "How?" "It's a small town," the woman said with a faint shrug. "Word gets around." There was something about her tone, an edge of guilt or maybe fear, that set Sarah on edge. "Do you know something about the baby?" she asked, her voice sharper now. The woman looked down at the ground, her hands fidgeting nervously. I don't know," she said finally. Maybe. Sarah's patience snapped. Look, if you know something, you need to tell me. That child could have died out there. The woman flinched at Sarah's words, her face crumpling. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, she whispered. I swear. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Sarah's mind raced, connecting the dots faster than she could process them. You're the one who left the baby? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. It wasn't my baby, she said. I was just trying to help. Sarah's confusion deepened. What do you mean? Help who? The woman looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. It's complicated, she said. The mother, she's in trouble. She begged me to keep the babies safe, to hide them somewhere no one would find them. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't just leave the baby out there alone. Sarah's stomach churned. So you thought my farm was a good spot? She asked, her voice tight with anger and disbelief. The woman nodded miserably. I saw your horse, she said. She looked kind. I thought she might lead someone to the baby. Sarah stared at her, stunned into silence. It was the most bizarre, heartbreaking explanation she could have imagined. Finally, she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. You need to tell the police, she said firmly. They need to know the truth. The woman hesitated, her fear evident. If I go to the police, they'll ask about the mother, she said. And I can't. She's in danger. If I say anything, it could make things worse. Sarah shook her head, her frustration mounting. You don't understand, she said. That baby deserves a chance. Whatever's going on, the police can help. But you can't keep hiding this. The woman seemed torn, her gaze darting between Sarah and the ground. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. Okay, she said. I'll talk to them, but only if you come with me. Sarah hesitated, her instinct to stay out of the mess warring with her sense of responsibility. Finally, she sighed. Fine, she said, but we're doing this today. As they drove to the police station, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a much larger story. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle missing. And deep down, she knew the road ahead would only get more complicated. The baby's story was far from over, and Sarah had the sinking feeling that she was about to become a bigger part of it than she ever intended. The drive to the police station was filled with an uneasy silence. Sarah kept glancing at the woman, who sat fidgeting with the strap of her bag, her face pale and her lips pressed tightly together. There were so many things Sarah wanted to ask, but she held back. The truth would come out soon enough, and pressing the woman now would only heighten the tension hanging between them. When they arrived, the woman hesitated before stepping out of the car. Sarah waited, giving her the time she needed. Finally, with a deep breath, the woman opened the door and climbed out. Together, they walked into the station, where the faint hum of voices and ringing phones filled the air. A young officer at the front desk greeted them, his expression neutral but alert. Sarah took the lead, explaining briefly who they were and why they were there. The officer's brows furrowed as he listened, and then he nodded, gesturing for them to follow him to a quieter room in the back. The woman sat down stiffly in the chair, her hands clenched in her lap. Sarah sat beside her, feeling an odd mix of empathy and frustration. This woman had answers that could change everything, and yet she seemed paralyzed by fear. A detective entered the room shortly after, his sharp eyes flicking between them as he introduced himself. So, he began, his voice calm but firm. I understand you have information about the baby that was found on Ms. Green's property. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the table. Yes, she whispered. The detective leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. We're listening. Start from the beginning. Her voice wavered as she began to speak, and her story unfolded in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror. She explained that she had been helping a friend, a young woman named Lena, who was in a desperate and dangerous situation. Lena had been in an abusive relationship, trapped by fear and unable to leave. When she discovered she was pregnant, things only got worse. The man threatened her, saying she would never keep the baby, that she wasn't fit to be a mother. Terrified, Lena reached out to the only person she trusted, the woman sitting across from Sarah now. I didn't know what to do, the woman said, her voice cracking. Lena begged me to help her. She was scared he'd hurt the baby. She didn't know where to go, and I didn't know how to protect her. So, when the baby was born, I thought it would be safer if I took the baby and hid it. The detective's expression remained steady, though his eyes darkened slightly. And leaving the baby in a box near the pasture was your solution? Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she shook her head. I didn't mean for it to sound so terrible. I thought someone would find the baby quickly, especially with the horse nearby. It was stupid, I know, but I panicked. I didn't think anyone would believe me if I went to the police. I didn't want the baby to end up with him. Sarah watched as the detective took a deep breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. Where is Lena now? He asked. Do you know where she is? The woman hesitated, her face crumpling. I haven't seen her in days, she admitted. She was supposed to meet me after I left the baby, but she never showed up. I've been trying to reach her, but she's not answering her phone. A heavy silence filled the room. Sarah's heart ached as she listened. The situation was more dire than she had imagined. It wasn't just about the baby anymore. It was about Lena too. If she was still with the man who had threatened her, who knew what could have happened? The detective stood, his expression grim. We'll need to locate Lena immediately, he said. If she's in danger, every second counts. The woman nodded weakly, providing Lena's address and any other detail she could remember. As the detective left to organize a search, Sarah turned to the woman, her voice gentle despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. You did the best you could, she said. But now we need to make sure Lena's safe. The woman gave a small, tearful nod, but the guilt in her eyes was unmistakable. Hours passed like an eternity. Sarah stayed at the station, her thoughts racing as she tried to piece everything together. The baby was safe, but Lena's fate hung in the balance. Questions swirled in her mind. Was Lena still alive? Had the man found out what she had done? And if the police found her, would she finally be free? Or would the situation take an even darker turn? Late into the evening, the detective returned. His face gave nothing away, and Sarah's stomach tightened as he approached. We found her, he said finally. The woman beside Sarah let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her face. But the detective wasn't finished. She's alive, he continued, but she's not in good shape. She's scared and malnourished, and she's been hiding at a friend's house, too afraid to come forward. She's agreed to meet with us, but it's going to take time to get her to open up. Sarah felt a surge of relief mingled with dread. Lena was alive, but the nightmare was far from over. The man who had terrorized her was still out there, and now the police would need to find him and prove his guilt before Lena and the baby could truly be safe. As the pieces of the story began to come together, Sarah realized just how fragile the situation was. The lives of an innocent baby and a terrified mother were hanging in the balance, and every decision made in the coming days would determine their future. The tension in the air was palpable as Sarah and the woman left the station that night. Driving home, Sarah couldn't help but glance over at her passenger, who looked utterly exhausted but somehow lighter, as if unburdening herself had lifted some of the weight she had been carrying. When they pulled into the driveway, Daisy was waiting near the fence, her head lifting at the sound of the car. Sarah smiled faintly, grateful for the horse's steady presence. She knew this wasn't the end of the story, far from it. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that the pieces might finally fall into place. The night was quiet, but Sarah's mind wasn't. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought of the baby, Lena, and the dangerous man still out there. The climax of this story was fast approaching, and Sarah had the sinking feeling that things would get worse before they got better. The following morning, Sarah woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the bedside table. The sun had barely risen, and the pale light filtering through her curtains gave the room a grayish glow. She squinted at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. Her heart sank with unease. Calls this early were rarely good news. "Hello," she said, her voice still groggy. "Ms. Green, this is Detective Harris," came the steady voice on the other end. "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Sarah sat up, her pulse quickening. "Is everything okay? Did something happen to Lena?" There was a pause, and she could hear papers rustling in the background. Lena's safe, but we have a new problem. It turns out the man we're looking for isn't just her abuser. He's wanted in connection to a larger case, and this situation might be bigger than we thought. I'll explain more in person, but I need to know if you've noticed anything unusual around your property since finding the baby. Sarah frowned, her mind racing. Unusual? Like what? Strangers, vehicles parked nearby. Anything that seems out of place, Harris clarified. Her thoughts flickered back to the past few days. She had been so focused on the baby and Lena's story that she hadn't been paying close attention to her surroundings. I don't think so, she said hesitantly. But I'll keep an eye out. Harris thanked her and ended the call, leaving Sarah with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. She swung her legs out of bed and got dressed quickly, her mind churning with questions. If the man Lena was running from was involved in something larger, did that mean he might come looking for her, or worse, for the baby? And what could possibly tie him to a broader investigation? The detective's cryptic words hung heavily in her mind. Stepping outside, Sarah felt a chill despite the warming sun. Daisy was grazing near the edge of the pasture, her calm presence a small comfort. Sarah walked to the barn, her boots crunching on the gravel, but the sound of her own footsteps wasn't as reassuring as it usually was. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than usual, scanning the tree line for anything or anyone out of place. By mid-morning, Sarah received another call, this time from Lena herself. Her voice was soft and shaky, but there was a determination underneath that hadn't been there before. I need to see my baby, Lena said, her words trembling with emotion. I can't go another day without knowing she's okay. Sarah's heart ached at the plea. Of course, she said, but are you sure it's safe? Harris said, I'll be careful, Lena interrupted. I need this. Please. Sarah agreed, and they arranged to meet later that day. She called Harris immediately after to let him know, and he promised to have officers discreetly nearby, just in case. Sarah hung up feeling a mixture of anticipation and dread. This meeting could be a step toward healing for Lena, or it could draw unwanted attention. When Lena arrived, she looked even more fragile than Sarah had imagined. Her clothes hung loosely on her thin frame, and dark circles under her eyes hinted at sleepless nights and constant fear. But the moment Sarah handed her the baby, Lena's entire demeanor shifted. She held the infant close, tears streaming down her face as she whispered words of love and promises of protection. It was a moment so raw and pure that even Daisy, standing nearby, seemed to sense its weight, nudging Sarah gently as if to say, this is what matters. But the tender moment was shattered when a loud engine roared in the distance. Sarah's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. A dark SUV was speeding down the road toward her property, its tires kicking up dust as it approached. She felt a chill run through her as she turned to Lena, whose face had gone pale with terror. It's him, Lena whispered, clutching the baby tighter. Sarah acted on instinct, ushering Lena toward the barn. Get inside and stay out of sight, she said firmly. Don't come out until I say it's safe. As Lena disappeared into the shadows of the barn, Sarah turned back toward the approaching vehicle, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. The SUV skidded to a halt just outside the fence, and the driver's door flew open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his face twisted with anger. Where is she? He bellowed, his voice carrying across the yard. Sarah's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand her ground. You need to leave, she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. You're trespassing. The man's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, his movements deliberate and menacing. Don't play games with me, he snarled. I know she's here. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Relief flooded her as two police cruisers appeared at the end of the driveway, their lights flashing. The man froze, his gaze darting between Sarah and the approaching vehicles. For a moment, it looked like he might run, but then he raised his hands in mock surrender, a sneer spreading across his face. The officers moved quickly, surrounding him and placing him in handcuffs. As they led him to one of the cruisers, Harris approached Sarah, his expression both grim and relieved. Good timing, Sarah said, her voice shaky. You have no idea, Harris replied. This guy's been on our radar for years. He's connected to a human trafficking ring we've been trying to shut down. Lena and the baby were lucky to get away. Sarah felt a wave of nausea at the revelation. The stakes had been high before, but now they were almost unfathomable. She glanced toward the barn, where Lena and the baby were still hidden, and realized just how close they had come to a far worse outcome. But even with the man in custody, Sarah knew the battle wasn't over. Lena would need help rebuilding her life, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. And as for the baby, her future was still uncertain. The twists and turns of this journey had been overwhelming. But one thing was clear: Daisy's instincts had saved a life. And now, Sarah was determined to see this story through to the end, no matter what it took. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time the commotion on Sarah's property finally settled. The police vehicles were gone, leaving behind tracks in the gravel, and the only sounds now were the soft rustling of the trees and the occasional snort from Daisy in the pasture. Sarah stood by the barn, leaning against the worn wooden doorframe as she watched Lena gently rock her baby in her arms. For the first time in days, there was a fragile sense of peace, though it felt almost too delicate to trust. Detective Harris had stayed behind for a few minutes after the arrest, ensuring that both Sarah and Lena understood what would happen next. The man, Lena's abuser and the one connected to the trafficking ring, was in custody, and evidence was piling up against him. Harris had reassured them that Lena and the baby were now safer than they'd been in a long time, but he also didn't sugarcoat the reality. There would be legal proceedings, and Lena would need to cooperate to fully sever ties with her past. After Harris left, Lena had remained quiet, her emotions shifting between relief and exhaustion. Now, as Sarah watched her cradle the baby, she finally spoke. "I don't know how to thank you," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to do any of this, but you did. You saved us." Sarah shook her head, her throat tightening. "You don't owe me anything," she replied softly. "Daisy was the one who found your baby. I just followed her lead." She smiled faintly, glancing at the horse grazing peacefully in the distance. "I think she knew something special was happening long before we did." Lena managed a small smile of her own, brushing her fingers lightly over her baby's tiny hand. "She's incredible, and so are you." Over the next few days, Sarah worked to help Lena settle into a safe space. The police arranged for her to stay at a secure shelter for survivors of abuse, a place where she and her baby could begin to rebuild their lives without fear. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a good start. Before Lena left, Sarah promised to visit and stay in touch, offering any support she could provide. "You're not alone in this," Sarah told her firmly. "Remember that." As Sarah watched them drive away, a mix of emotions swirled within her. She felt relief that Lena and the baby were safe, but there was also a lingering sadness, a heaviness that came from witnessing just how much they'd endured. Still, she reminded herself that this was a new chapter for them, one filled with possibilities they hadn't had before. Life on the farm slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Sarah spent her days tending to Daisy and the other animals, finding solace in the quiet work. But something had shifted in her. She couldn't stop thinking about Lena's story, about the courage it took for her to fight for her baby, even when the odds were stacked against her. It reminded Sarah of the strength that often lies hidden in people until they're pushed to their limits. Word of what had happened spread through the small community, and neighbors began stopping by to check in on Sarah and Daisy. Some brought meals or small gifts, while others simply offered kind words of support. One evening, an older couple who lived down the road came by with their grandchildren. They asked if they could meet Daisy, the horse who had become something of a local hero. Sarah laughed, agreeing to let them visit, and Daisy soaked up the attention, nuzzling the children gently and flicking her ears as if she understood the praise being lavished upon her. But it wasn't just the community that had taken notice. A local journalist reached out to Sarah, hoping to write a story about the remarkable bond between Daisy and the baby she had found. At first, Sarah was hesitant. She didn't want to exploit what had happened or draw unnecessary attention to Lena and her baby. But after some thought, she realized the story could inspire others. It wasn't just about Daisy's incredible instincts. It was about resilience, hope, and the kindness that can emerge even in the darkest of times. The article was published a few weeks later, and the response was overwhelming. People from across the country reached out, sharing their own stories of animals who had made a difference in their lives. Some even offered donations to support Lena and the shelter she was staying in. Sarah was moved by the outpouring of kindness, and she made sure every message and donation reached Lena, who was slowly finding her footing in her new life. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah began to see a transformation in Lena. They stayed in touch regularly, and each time they spoke, Lena sounded a little stronger, a little more confident. She started taking small steps toward independence, enrolling in parenting classes and looking into job opportunities. The shelter staff provided her with resources and guidance, helping her navigate the challenges of single motherhood. It wasn't easy, but Lena was determined to build a stable future for her and her baby. One sunny afternoon, Lena came back to the farm for a visit. This time, she looked healthier and more at ease, her smile brighter than Sarah had ever seen. The baby, now several months old, giggled happily in her arms, reaching out toward Daisy, who sniffed curiously at the tiny hand. Sarah felt a surge of pride and happiness as she watched them together. This moment, simple, peaceful, and filled with love, felt like the culmination of everything they had fought for. "I've been thinking about something," Lena said as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "About what I want to do next." Sarah looked at her, intrigued. "What's that?" "I want to help other women like me," Lena said, her voice steady. "There are so many out there who feel trapped, who don't know where to turn. If I can use what I've been through to make a difference, then maybe it was all worth it." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with admiration. "That's a beautiful goal, Lena, and I have no doubt you'll make a difference." As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The unexpected arrival of the baby, the harrowing events that followed, and the incredible bond that had formed between all of them. It was a journey she would never forget. And through it all, Daisy had been a constant, her quiet strength and intuition guiding them toward hope. In the days that followed, Sarah decided to write down the story, not just for herself, but as a way to preserve the memory of everything they had overcome together. She wanted to honor Lena's courage, the baby's resilience, and Daisy's extraordinary role in bringing them all together. It was a story of hope, healing, and the power of connection, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable challenges, there is always a way forward. And so, as life continued on the farm, Sarah carried the lessons of this journey with her, knowing that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness and the most unexpected moments can change everything.